The Southwest Transitway, Winnipeg's largest investment in public transit infrastructure in recent years. And it's a big project too. It connects the University of Winnipeg downtown to the University of Manitoba in the south end of the city. And it's a great project. It transports thousands of people every day. It runs buses at high frequencies, and it has a lot of opportunities for transit-oriented development. However, this project was originally proposed in the 1970s. And it took until 2020 for the final leg, which I'm standing in front of today, to finally open for service. That's nearly 50 years of this being an idea to being reality. We cannot keep building transit infrastructure that slowly. We have to pick up the pace when it comes to transit infrastructure. We're facing a climate crisis, and we need people to take transit more seriously, and we need to increase density in transit-oriented developments. That's what today's mayoral candidate wants to talk about. They were actually a big proponent of the Southwest Transitway, really pushing for it in the early 2000s. Now, 18 years later, they are running for office again. I'm so excited to share this conversation with you. This is Transit Talks Election 2022. So today I'm joined by a very familiar face here in Winnipeg, Glen Murray, who was mayor from 1998 to 2004.
Yeah, and then I was at City Hall as a councillor as well, so I was there for 15 years total.
Wow.
So quite a good stretch.
Very familiar face here in Winnipeg, and then after that you were the Minister of Infrastructure and Transportation in Ontario.
Right, and responsible for smart growth as well.
So a lot of transportation in your resume.
Well, and environment and climate change, right? That's where all the cap and trade money was funding all of the subways and the LRTs and the BRT systems. A lot of the money from that was coming from, I was spending the money when I was Transportation Infrastructure Minister. I'm saying that somewhat humorously because you obviously don't do that. The government was. I was trying to build and develop policies. But when I went to, it was interesting because I went to environment and climate change, I worked with California and Quebec to build this big cap and trade system, which was generating billions of dollars a year. And one of the largest things that we funded was, cycling, active transportation, $300 million a year, which is a record in North America, which is linked to transit. It's an important connection there. Is someone who is a cyclist and a transit user and doesn't own a car. And then the other one was just massive, the complete electrification of the GO system, all of the new LRTs and the ION in Waterloo, the new transit, even in Mississauga was getting rapid transit, even in Hamilton. So bringing it to cities for the first time in a big way. Yeah, transit infrastructure that we could only dream of here in Winnipeg. Yeah, it's true. But welcome back. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me today. I appreciate it a lot. We're talking transit here in Winnipeg. We are. So, from your perspective, the things from your own experience and from things that you've heard in the community, what are the issues facing Winnipeg Transit today? Well, I think there's three sets of issues. There's what we call service levels. That's important. Yeah. That's important for all people who rely on transit to get around. There's safety, which is more of an issue now, generally in urban environments, but it certainly affects transit. And how do we think about that? And the other one that we don't talk about as much, which is, I think you used the word earlier, and it's the word I use as well, which is city building. The city building aspects and the competitiveness of a city is linked to the type of higher order transit you have. Right.
So Winnipeg Transit has developed this Winnipeg Transit Master Plan to address some of these issues. It's a 25-year plan. I'm sure everyone who's been watching these knows something about it. What are your thoughts on the master plan?
Well, I think it's good. I think the people who worked on it did a really good job, but I think it was an environment of low ambition and low levels of political leadership. I mean, there was really clear that this was being pushed onto the city by the community, by functional transit, by the environmental community, by the urbanist city building community, by Winnipeggers who want a highly livable, beautiful city. We're pushing that. There wasn't a lot of leadership saying, yeah, we're going to make this a big commitment. So, if you look at Quebec City, Hamilton got $3.8 billion from the federal and provincial government. I was part of that. For their LRT system, so Winnipeg is a higher economic need threshold than a city within the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. So you should make the case that we should be up in the $4 billion level of investment in higher order transit, and we don't even have an application that comes in for 10% of that right now.
Right. So is this a 25-year plan?
No, my plan is, I would say So here's the thing that's really good. There's a social economic component
Right.
for people who are lower income and for a whole range of other folks, but who do it by choice because they just prefer it. But there's some people who do it out of real need. The economics of their life depend on transit, and especially for working moms, single parents. You have to have service. So the plan I proposed, which is an acceleration of the Transit Master Plan, right, with some modifications, but it basically is true, is to do it in 8 years and electrify the whole, well, do the electrification in 8 years. And then deal with the climate crisis. Let's get us as close as we can to a zero emissions transit system. We have to be carbon neutral before 2050, really. Right. And while the city doesn't have the levers the province and the federal government have over motor vehicles and things like that, we have very strong levers over transit and can do that. The other thing is, when you flip the transit system from one that runs on diesel, you want to get from diesel to electric in its entirety, 100% system, because managing the repair and maintenance of two different technologies, a diesel technology and electric technology, is very expensive, especially when the electric motors are very low maintenance. There's not a lot of costs associated with them. The fuel costs drop dramatically. An all-electric system is a much less expensive system to support than a diesel system. And probably the worst scenario is you want to get through that transition to having having diesel and motor buses out there, because that would be your highest maintenance cost, your highest energy cost would probably come under that scenario. So that's why I'm saying 8 years. And I just didn't make this up. I worked quite closely. Paul Subry said to me when I went out to New Flyer, I was the only candidate, and really the only councillor who's come out there in years, and certainly the only one during the campaign, to sit down and say, okay, how do we do this? And he said, producing, they can do 600 buses in a year. So there's nothing on the bus thing. We have to have a deal with both with Manitoba Hydro, and we have to get into more redistributive energy systems, which I can talk a little bit about. So we create a greater amount of electricity. And you look at some of the new communities that are being built in Canada. There's some called Green Earth Villages, which are basically carbon neutral. They're all off grid. They're quite remarkable. So generating the electricity for the system, I don't think will be too much of a challenge, but it will involve a partnership. And then get that done. And then the other question we should probably talk about, if you want to, is infrastructure.
Right, and I think, you're talking about doing the Transit Master Plan in 8 years. What I'm wondering at that is, are you talking about the service network in 8 years, or are you talking about all the infrastructure related, like the Union Station, the bridge from the U of M to St. Vital, transit ways down Portage?
As much as we can, and because, that's a competitive construction schedule, but I would differentiate. There's issues, there's 3 issues here. So one of them is, what does it cost? And are there areas where, if we really want to prioritize what the city was originally built on, we were a streetcar city. There's a lot of writing now where people say, were you a streetcar city or are you not a streetcar city? And if you're not a streetcar city, you just don't have the width and the right of ways to adapt on-street rapid transit, whether it's LRT or BRT. It's harder to do that. Cities that are what are called streetcar cities, because Winnipeg was the second city in North America after Richmond to have a comprehensive streetcar system, an electrified one. So about half of our city is configured for on-road rail. So that means that the ability, if we want to look at a street-based system, which would reduce the volume of traffic, because those kinds of systems tend to be more effective at getting people out of their cars, because it's familiar and it's close. And you're aligned with the road system. So where you have crowded regional streets, doing this, if they're 8 lanes wide or 10 lanes, with turning lanes, some of them more, then it's easier to do that. So the degree to which we do an on-street system would reduce the cost and speed it up. The second thing is the issue of something that we're doing. Big report's going to be coming out in about 2 weeks on value planning, which is, if you build some infrastructure, it actually grows the tax base more than it costs to build. We haven't done much rapid transit to the extent that that's really measurable, but I'll give you the way they do it in Illinois and Maryland. They have actually a whole tax unit financing scheme that measures whether or not there's actual uplift in value for transit. And the city of Chicago is paying for its large part of its red line based on the higher property values and increased density and development that occurs from the development of the red line. So we did Waterfront Drive. That was the first time in Winnipeg we actually tried it. Senator Venture looked at that and said, okay, so we know it's going to cost $10 to $12 million to build this whole roadway and improve the park and incentives for infill development and residential conversion of buildings. but what are the revenues going to be? Right. And we estimated 25 million over 4 or 5 years. What we got was much greater than that. If we got $4, $5, $6 for every dollar we invested. So building Waterfront Drive, because it brought so much development there, and it took many vacant historic buildings that were adjacent to it or 1 block away, and dropped the vacancy rates. I mean, some buildings, will drop vacancy rates from 60% to 6% or less. Right. So that massive investment, that huge drop in vacancy, grew the tax base so much that had we not built Waterfront Drive, we would have ended up with a lot less revenue coming into the city.
Right.
Because we built Waterfront Drive and the parkway, we made it beautiful and we designed it properly. Waterfront Drive was a moneymaker for us. It actually built the tax base way beyond what it cost. So if you think about rapid transit lines, whether they're rail or they're BRT, the bus rapid transit systems, how you design them, what kind of co-located development is behind them? Can you build the really truly beautiful, dynamic, transit-oriented developments along those routes at key nexuses and hubs so that you have that you're using the rapid transit line as one to be the spine of denser, more walkable development with commercial areas, and that you're going to get a population. If you do that, the same thing happens as happened on Waterfront Drive.
Right.
You're putting parks in there, you're creating clusters of development, you're building the tax base, and you can measure that to see if that development is sufficient to cover at least the city's share of the cost of developing that line.
Right.
When you look at the BRT line that runs through Winnipeg right now from Harkness and Osborne Station all the way south, no one's going to accuse that of being a catalyst for development. Right. It's almost like they designed it so no one could live with it, live around it. And when Charles Marone was here, he went on a ride. I went on this tour with him, and he stopped at the one in the where the Fort Rouge Yards are, and he had about a whole bunch of different people, suburbanites, downtown people, councillors from across the city, and he asked them how many of you would want to live here, because they just plunked apartments there, put a huge parking lot between the apartments, and there's really no amenities there. It's certainly not a TOD, and the development was really unattractive to live in. Like it wouldn't be a choice neighborhood to live in. And the point he was making was we had designed a transit way that people would not want to live with because it wasn't very physically attractive. It was the development wasn't compatible. So long and the short of it, to sum up, is you have to design these. So what I'm saying is we're going to do a value planning exercise. We're going to design these the way Vancouver does, the way that Kitchener-Waterloo is, the way that Toronto does. So you're actually dealing with an integrated transportation, rapid transit, and residential and development plan. So you're planning your land use, your buildings, your shops. You're going to plan the commercial uses along the way to get the built development that's going to create the tax base to pay for the line. Right. Then this whole proposal that I'm proposing becomes very financially sustainable. Yeah. But the difference is if you build it the way we're building it right now, it would cost you a small fortune. If you're building it the way that other cities did, if you build it the way we did Waterfront Drive with parks and designs making it beautiful, it won't cost you a lot. Matter of fact, you'll reduce your structural costs of city because you'll be building your tax base so much.
Right. Lots to unpack there. I do want to talk about your campaign slogan, Let's Get Winnipeg Back on Track. Now, tracks, trains run on tracks. Right. Winnipeg used to have streetcars, like you mentioned, back on track. Am I reading too much into this? Or
No, let's cut right to the chase, because this is probably, for me, one of the most difficult parts of this conversation. Yeah. Because there's one Glen over here saying, God, nothing builds a city's image and its modernity and its cool factor, and no form of transit gets more people on rapid transit than light rapid transit. Right. And I, as a transportation infrastructure minister in Ontario and as an environment minister, I spent most of my time in the Ontario legislature as one of the two ministers that I had one of either portfolio. When I worked those three ministries, of which I was minister of two at one time, and then I had environment, but I also had the climate change strategy, which this was a big part of, obviously. So I really saw what LRTs are doing for Hamilton. As a matter of fact, when I was president of the Canadian Urban Institute, I led the studies that looked at what the impacts, how would LRT work, how could it be financed in two different LRT projects in Hamilton, and came to the conclusion that Hamilton really needed LRT to compete with Toronto and to compete with Mississauga and Brampton and Kitchener, all of these other regional cities that were getting LRT. But Hamilton also was like Winnipeg, had a large street railway system, and has gone down to bus. the two challenges, and the two things about why I'm suggesting we get we get a completely electrified BRT system, and we get the plan implemented in one form or the other. And there's some different variants, which I talked about. How much on road do you want to do? How much is separated lanes?
Right.
How much is TODs? How much of that is going to be a spine for TOD development along it? All of those things have to be worked out very quickly in the next 2 years. And then I think you just have to we think we can do it in 8 years. Certainly the technology, all of the infrastructure, a good chunk of that infrastructure could be there within 8 years. Yeah. Maybe not all of it, but a good chunk of it. And that would give us service levels of an average wait time of 5 minutes, because your head times would be down to 10 minutes, which means your average wait times would be about 5. Right now it's 15. And what's important to me on the service levels argument we talked about is that it has to be frequent enough on the main lines, on the 13 main lines, that you would never ever imagine to consult a schedule. Yeah. So the flipping point of where do you get high ridership with frequency is the moment that you have a system where you don't take your schedule or go on and get your app and say, when's the next bus coming, right? Yeah. So we want to get on all the regional, like all the 13 big lines, we want them all with less than a 5-minute wait. As soon as you have that, you have a schedule-free system. No one's going to use a schedule, and that's important because that changes the whole dynamic, and that really boosts your ridership. Yeah. Then I think phase 2 of this is that you look at the crosstown lines. I mean, a big north-south and a big east-west crosstown line, which is what's happening in, that's what's happening in Hamilton, that's what's happening in Kitchener, that's what happened in Vancouver originally, that's what Edmonton and Calgary does. But all those other cities already have significant LRT lines and are developing more. Yeah. We have invested less in rapid transit than almost any other major Canadian city. Yeah. So I would call it the 8 years of catch-up. Get the complete BRT system in place, get it completely electrified, start planning crosstown lines, because you're going to need them. Because I always heard when I was working in other cities, what I would hear from Winnipeggers I'd run into, and they'd always see me. I was teaching at U of T. I would get pack of it, tons of Winnipeggers, students coming out. And I would ask them, why did you live in Toronto? Like, what you miss? And they said, well, I couldn't live downtown. There wasn't enough residential development. I want to live in an urban environment. And my city really didn't offer me that. Yeah. And I said, I live in Toronto, I get on this beautiful LRT, and it streaks right through. I feel like I'm living in a 21st century city. I always felt like I was living in a last century city when I lived in Winnipeg. So that's an important part. Now, the negotiating skills with the federal government, we have to get a Hamilton-style deal. We have to get those $4 billion. And that 3.4 or $3.5 billion that Hamilton's getting is mostly federal money, and I think there might even be complete matching provincial dollars. But we have a few $100 million to buy some buses. We're still buying diesel buses. Yeah. And Hamilton, which is the other city that's coming from behind, I would say is as far behind other Canadian cities as Winnipeg is doing a leapfrog. They're going to leapfrog right past us in the next 8 years, and they're going to have significant LRT systems in Hamilton and that. So what I believe in, because working people rely on it, we need the 5-minute head times. We need the electrification. Let's get that done in 8 years. Yeah. And then let's start planning those routes, because it's going to take us 8 years to plan an LRT system. Yeah. And to get the commitments from the federal government, which is to pay for most of it, quite frankly.
How soon do you want to start planning it? Like, are you looking your first term getting a study done?
Well, if I'm elected, I'm going to do 2 terms, right? Yeah. Because I've always said that. I've always said that you do your 8 years. I bring more experience than I ever have had to this, and then you get out. But I want to see a 20-year plan. Mm-hmm. So in 8 years, I'd like to see this. I'd like us to have a very highly responsive. I'd like us to have the highest performance rapid transit system in Canada, even though some people who are LRT fans will not be as excited, because it will be a rapid BRT system with very new next generation technology. This isn't going to look like the buses we have on the street, even the electric buses right now. We have to get that done because the economy needs it, it requires it. I would like to have an approved crosstown plan by then. Okay. And I would like us to look at, when we're building the BRT system, that we're building it with the anticipation that we can overlay on the major, like if it's St. Mary's and Main Street, north-south, that we can overlay that. And if it's Portage Avenue and Provencher to go crosstown, that we can overlay that. That we're actually building crosstown technology that would be would be easily ramped up. But we're just starting way behind the 8 ball from other people. And we're not, I mean, people always talk about, is it downtown and the suburbs competing? Well, no city would have suburbs if there wasn't a healthy downtown. And the health of your downtown and the health of the suburbs are interdependent. So that's not the competition. We're looking at a lot of empty nesters and millennials who would like to live downtown. They want to live near the theater, the baseball park, the games. They want to be near Waterfront Drive. They want to be, near all of the arts and museums and theaters and, non-such and Little Brown Jug and all of these the places that are just attract a lot of younger people and older people. There's kind of cool things down there. So people want that. But what we're competing with, what downtown Winnipeg and the urban core is competing is with now the urban core of Calgary and Hamilton and Toronto and Vancouver. And you talked about living in Vancouver. And what was the big attraction for you? It was the livability of your neighborhood. It was how walkable it was. It was the residential choices you had. It was the beautiful comfort of getting on a rapid transit rail-based system and zooming into wherever you wanted to go. We have to compete with that. And we will not retain young people, nor will we be one of the constellation of cities that attracts talent and attracts population unless we compete not just on the metrics of frequency of service, which are essential, but also on the modernity and excitement and design and energy the transit system brings to the city.
Yeah. Well, look, you're preaching to the choir. I agree wholeheartedly that we have to compete a little more, I think, with infrastructure and with mobility to keep young people here. We have the culture in Winnipeg. We have a great, strong culture, but we're missing some key pieces that build a strong city on the infrastructure side.
Right, and I don't think there's another candidate that has a serious understanding or commitment or experience on this. And the only successful negotiations that ever occurred were when I was mayor and we did what was originally going to be an LRT design. So part of the reason the Osborne station looks the way it does is the configuration was that would be an LRT station. Yeah. But the province was not on board at the time. And the feds, once the province wasn't on board, were really limited in the scope of funding they could give us. So we were basically, that first agreement was, because it's a trilateral agreement, the province can decide. It was mostly, in those negotiations, it was the city and the federal government that said we would support a priority on our first serious rapid transit line in the city, well, first one at all. And then when I left, that got undone very quickly, both by the province and the mayor who replaced me. And then since then, we haven't had anyone who's been prepared to do what the mayor of Hamilton did, the mayor of Toronto did, the mayor of Kitchener did, the mayor of Quebec City did, the mayor of Ottawa did, the mayor of Edmonton did, the mayor of Calgary did, the mayor of Vancouver. I could go on, but I think you get my point. Yeah. The mayor of Mississauga even. All who have said rapid transit and rail rapid transit is a priority have all pushed the federal government to put hundreds of billions of dollars into this over this decade and the next decade, and are lined up to get the biggest chunk for their city. And we haven't had a mayor standing in that line or pushing that. And I used to be chair of the Big City Mayors Caucus. I was elected by all these other mayors to lead that. And we did the New Deal for Cities. We got the gas tax to fix our roads and our potholes and our streets. So I'm the only mayor, I'm the only person in this race, and the other councillors that have been in this race have shown very little interest in rapid transit, certainly not even approaching a serious conversation about how to do LRT, how to pay for it. And I think I've got that, and I've got a plan on my website, which is Glen, numeric number 4, WPGWinnipeg.ca. And so if you go there, you can see it in detail, because it's kind of hard to follow this conversation. But I just think that it is the way to go. I don't think it's BRT or LRT. I think it's the sequencing of how we do this. Right. And each, as I said, the city building aspect is really critical. We've got to be building towards that as quickly as we can. But it's the service levels and the proper routing that every single working mom and dad, everyone who has to get to work, cares most right now about having a system where they don't need a schedule. They just can walk to the rapid transit stop or their local bus stop, and they know within a couple of minutes that vehicle is going to be there for them. That's the biggest driver of ridership. So a big part of your plan is zero emission buses. Yeah. Right? And Winnipeg is kind of toying with the idea. We've been toying with it for a while. You mentioned the technology's developed here. And Winnipeg's looking at 2 forms of zero emission buses, the hydrogen fuel cell and the battery electric buses. There's a pilot project in the works right now where I think we're ordering quite a few of them, 16 of each, I think. There's a pilot project, 4 of each. It's going down to 4. It's very little. The next year it's 4. I went out to talk to New Flyer. Yeah. And I talked like this is not a serious effort. So
Yeah.
first of all, we're going to have to electrify the whole system.
Yeah.
And we don't have time for pilot projects or still buying diesel buses.
Yeah.
And it's not either or. This is when I talk to Pulse Uber, and I talk to people, and I talk to other third parties, functional transit. You have battery electric buses and you have fuel cell battery electric buses.
Yeah.
And they have to do with distance.
Yeah.
So like most of the bus routes, you would be fine with battery. Some of the longer, what would be the ones that would probably eventually become LRTs, would be your crosstown buses, the ones that require fuel cell because they have extended range, right? And they're easier to charge because they carry more. So and they can be filled up quickly. So any kind of serious planning, when you talk to New Flyer, who sells electric buses to all of the cities that use that, you would need both, and you would want to buy both. And you would need to, in the next year, lay out in your plan what the mix would be depending on the configuration of routes. So it's not either or. It's also the charging technology. The third thing is, when we buy buses in small numbers, they're very, very expensive. If we make a commitment, as I would make, to buy 650 buses over the next 8 years, the price, not only does the price come down, but we're talking about a different system of procurement. We're talking about life cycle procurement. Yeah. So we would still have city employees doing the maintenance and stuff, and they would train that. But you would have a funding partner in the development of the charging stations and that. And most importantly, when you buy each of those buses, you're buying the parts and supply for them. Right. So one of the problems we have at Winnipeg Transit, and will become even more acute if we're trying to run an electric system and a diesel system at the same time, is that you need the full amount of parts. Yeah. And so when you buy that, let's say we buy it from New Flyer, let's say they win the bid, then New Flyer would then have all the parts. They know how many wipers and that when they can buy parts for 2-3 years in advance, the parts and the maintenance costs come down because you're buying not just a bus, you're buying a bus and the service and needs for that bus through the life cycle of it. And that is a different point. You can't do that when you're buying 4 buses or 16 buses. Or you need to do that and that. And if you've committed to convert your whole fleet over 8 years, then you save a lot of money because then you can manage the full planning of your garage. You know the date you're going fully electric on certain routes. You know where you need your infrastructure. If we're going to do it incrementally, which is what just about every one of my opponents is suggesting, that's going to be very, very expensive, and it's not going to get us to the service levels that we need to make a difference in ridership, and it's not going to get us a system that really has significant greenhouse gas reductions anytime soon. So I think the plan I'm proposing is dramatically different on all of those fronts.
Yeah, very good points. The last thing I want to talk about is I think it's called your Transit Innovation Center.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, I'm in the ICT sector. That's where I work, and we have a whole bunch of folks who do things on smart technology, apps, the integration of the online world and systems, into online systems, from guidance systems to safety systems on buses to scheduling systems and animation, automated, reader boards and the whole thing, right? Multi-vehicle, multi-modal training. So you want to plan a trip that ends with a car share and starts with the bus, you can do that as an integrated system. Yeah. You can't get in the door. There's no place. So in New York, they started this transit tech lab, and every year every time transit has challenges over there, they put out a call and they do a design competition as a prize, and all these companies compete to create software technology and mechanical systems improvements, and it's incredible. It's brought all kinds of massive new numbers of jobs, helped companies expand, and what I think right now we have about 3,500 people working at New Flyer. We used to have 5,000. When I talked to Pulse Uber, when I talked to all my colleagues in the IT sector where I work, and in the transportation, energy, and buildings software area, we think that we could get thousands and thousands of new jobs in the city if we developed a tech lab. So New Flyer would be a major part of it because they would want to make their global innovation center here, because we go from 40 below in the winter to 40 above sometimes. We're pretty close to it in summer. So we have the perfect all-weather, all-season environment to test any kind of transportation road systems. And particularly with electrification, the advancements that are improving the performance of electrical vehicles in all seasons is really important. Yeah. And our bus manufacturing system, if we had our global design centers here, if we had our technology innovation systems here, if we had guidance system development design, and we take this whole cluster of IT software applications providers, which is we have almost 30,000 people working in that field. And the other is advanced composite materials. So we're making, the province has a biomaterial strategy. We're not making buses out of steel anymore. We're making them more often out of plant-based materials, even in that. So composites and advanced different types of composite materials would be another center. Yeah. So all of these technology advantages would be stimulated by the tech lab, because we put out calls for, we're looking for new light-weighted chassis for buses. We're looking for a better guidance system, on-road guidance system. We're looking at self-guided technologies and safety technologies. Well, Winnipeg companies and design companies could compete for that. As soon as everyone in the world knows, because there is no really global transportation tech lab for surface transportation. New York is multi-dimensional, mostly on subways. That's what would make Winnipeg a magnet for new investment in the clean technology systems, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. It would be amazing. And Paul Subry says, the biggest growth because of the Buy America policy, 70% of new flyer buses have to be made in the States. But the area for growth is all of the technology and design, where all the high value jobs. So it would allow New Flyer and that whole sector, motor coach industries and others, to really expand in the city. And this would be a great economic development tool for the city.
Very cool. Very interesting idea. Very quickly, last thing I want to ask you. Let's say we get a light rail system in Winnipeg, which I'm sure in my lifetime we will. There's no way that we can avoid it. Cities in Canada have come up with really cool names for their light rail systems. Ottawa has the O train, Calgary has the C train, Vancouver has the Sky train. What should Winnipeg call its train?
That would be a great thing for the tech lab to have a competition. It'd be. I would want to go back into the history, because people don't realize that Winnipeg has been a major innovator in water technology and all municipal services. We had the first high-pressure firefighting system, which was the reason we had more skyscrapers than any other city, because that St. James pumping station, all those high-pressure pipes, dropped fire insurance rates, and we exploded. We built really the first major street railway system in Canada, and maybe it should just be called the first system. Yeah. Something like that, or being number one. I like to go back into the iconic names and the history that goes back to the 1880s, and find something in our history that we can pull out, something that's really authentic about the experience of being the first serious electric rail system in Canada. We've got to find something. Interesting. My favorite one, my friend told me a few years ago, the Jet. The Winnipeg Jet. The Winnipeg Jet. Which I think is an interesting idea. What are some of the other ones? Yeah, it's the Red Rocket in Toronto is what they call the streetcars. Yeah, that's a cool one. Yeah. There's a few things. Or we could consult the Indigenous community too and see if there's something. Yeah, I mean, we're the most Indigenous city in that, so there'd probably be a really cool name. I remember when I was a little kid, the Olympics in Montreal were there, and they had the symbol for the Olympics was Amic, which was for beaver, in one of the languages of the Indigenous people of Quebec. But yeah, something like that would be really cool for us, I think, and it would be a great visual manifestation of Indigenous culture. There's some beautiful, beautiful names in Cree and Ojibwe and Oji-Cree and Lakota that would be really beautiful. Yeah, I think we should do that. I like that idea. Very good. Well, deal done. Nice to see you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Glenn, for your time. I appreciate it. It was a really great pleasure.